Welcome to the Alisa Childers podcast, where we equip Christians to identify the core beliefs of historic Christianity, discern its counterfeits, and proclaim the gospel with clarity, kindness, and truth. And as we talked about in the discussion that I've just had with Scott Allen, we can't really make these distinctions and preach the gospel and help people discern the counterfeits if words are constantly changing, and especially if words that are defined in the Bible, in other words, words that God has spoken and given definitions for, if we allow those words to be redefined in our culture, words like authority, faith, truth, beauty, freedom, human, um, we are going to be believing counterfeit gospels if we allow those words to be redefined from the definitions that God has given. That's why this conversation I just had with Scott Allen about his new book, 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World, Restoring the Meaning of Our Most Important Words, was so fascinating to me, because we talked about, first starting with that word truth. We've talked about that a lot on this podcast, how redefining the word truth would affect how we even think about the rest of these words that our culture has kind of co-opted and redefined to mean something entirely different. And some highlights of this conversation for me was really, as Scott was talking through some of these words, how the world has taken words that God meant to be good ones, like truth, like authority, faith, and actually kind of turned them into negative things. And in other cases with words like freedom, not every way the Bible talks about freedom is necessarily positive. Yes, we are set free, but that doesn't mean we're free to just do whatever we want to do. And yet our culture would redefine it in that way. Really, really powerful conversation. I thought this was so clarifying. I think it's going to equip you so much. Scott has written some really great books. Why Social Justice is Not Biblical Justice is one that he wrote a few years ago. He's got one called A Toxic New Religion, Understanding the Postmodern Neo-Marxist Faith that Seeks to Destroy the Judeo-Christian Culture of the West. I mean, talk about up our alley on this podcast. So I am so excited to bring this conversation to you. First-time guest for us, Scott Allen. I think you're going to love this. Here it is. Well, Scott, welcome to the podcast. So glad to have you join. For anybody who is unfamiliar with you, tell us a bit about yourself and the ministry you've done in your life and leading up to what you're doing today.
Sure. Well, it's such an honor to be with you, Alisa. Thank you for this opportunity. I started in ministry really right out of college. I'm from the state of Oregon, the beautiful state of Oregon, where I'm at today, and went to a very Oregon's kind of famous for its small secular universities, and I went to one of those very secular universities. And as a young Christian, I became a Christian when I was in high school through Young Life. But during my college days, got kind of immersed in a lot of kind of Marxist ideology, even in the 80s. But God really got a hold of my heart. Went to a missions conference, the big Urbana Missions Conference, my senior year, and felt a real calling to the poor, to ministry to the poor. God used the parable of the Good Samaritan significantly in my life, and joined the Christian Relief and Development Organization Food for the Hungry, which is, if some of your listeners might be familiar with groups like World
Sure, yeah.
Vision or Compassion International, very similar. And I worked with them for about 35 years, actually, and I've had a chance to work with them overseas, lived in Japan, traveled to many different countries, and was involved in training young people eventually to go and serve overseas. Had a real heart just to see impoverished communities rise out of poverty. And so worked on that for so many years with a man who is my best friend and colleague, Darrow Miller. And Darrow was a huge influence on my life. He spent his kind of formative years at L'Abri in Switzerland and was mentored by Francis Schaeffer. And so he had an approach or kind of a view towards how do we as Christians help the poor that was different from a lot of people. He felt like so much of the cause of poverty around the world was um, lies, really, just cultural lies.
Mm.
And that if you really wanted to see a change in communities rising out of poverty, you needed to address these deeper worldview lies. And so he began, we did together, I guess, really a ministry that was kind of raising poor communities out of poverty through discipleship. And I know that sounds kind of funny, but so much of poverty and development is all about kind of material transfer. People are poor, they need money, they need things, technology, and we'll do that. The problem with that, of course, is it doesn't get down to the root causes. And so, anyways, we began a teaching. This was about 20 years ago, that just took off around the world. And that became the ministry I'm involved in now, Disciple Nations Alliance, where we work with churches and we train churches all over the world in the basics of a biblical worldview with the idea of really seeing positive change in culture.
Wow, very good. Well, and there's such overlap with what you do and with what I do. Of
Mm,
course, you've addressed and written books about postmodernism and neo-Marxism and
mm,
social justice and how, some of this stuff is being co-opted and Christians are being sold a bill of goods saying, hey,
mm.
if you want to do good, do X, Y, or Z, but then X, Y, and Z get
Right,
redefined. And so,
right.
you even think about a word or a phrase like social justice, like, of course, what
Yeah,
Christian doesn't want to do justice and extend that justice in a social scenario. However, as we know, that phrase social justice has an actual meaning in
yes.
academia, and that's filtered out into the world. And so, you've got this book that you have just written called 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World. And
Mm,
I'm really fascinated by this because one of the things that I've seen as things like the social justice ideologies, postmodernism, progressive
mm,
Christianity creep their way and continue to creep their way into the church, a
yes.
lot of that happens at the level of the weaponization of language. And there's this famous
Yeah.
maxim that says if you want to change culture, you begin by changing the language. So you're addressing 10 words that have
Mm,
been co opted, kind of weaponized, redefined. And I would love to talk through some of those words, but to lay the foundation before we get to the actual words,
mm.
let's talk about words because you go
Sure.
back to
Yeah.
Derrida. He didn't believe words could be pinned down to singular meanings. Yet we're here having a conversation that we're expecting people
Right.
to understand our attention. So,
Right.
talk about the power of words and really the battle over the definitions and the connotations
Yeah.
and the meanings.
Sure. Yeah. That phrase, if you want to see change in a culture, if you want to change a culture, you begin by changing language. That was something that Darrow, my mentor, mentioned to me many years ago. And it just was one of those ideas that just sparked something in my mind. It gave me a fascination with the power of words and language. And words are incredibly powerful. And the Bible makes that point explicitly. You think of the Gospel of John, which begins with, in the beginning was the Word, and the
Yeah.
Word was with God, and the Word was God. Through the Word, God spoke everything into existence. So God is a God of language, and He speaks. And then He made us in His image and gave us this amazing, miraculous capacity to use words and language. And as Darrow said, when God, speaks, He creates everything out of nothing. When we speak, we who bear His image speak, we create culture. So we also create with words and language, not in the same way that God does, but our words do, they're the basic building blocks of culture. And over time, Christian mission has been very powerful, especially since the Reformation in this way, when the reformers translated the Word of God, which is so powerful, into native languages, indigenous languages. And when that happened, first Germany, German, French, Spanish, eventually English, and now, many languages around the world, it introduced new words. I remember talking to somebody who said that so many of the words we take for granted in English didn't exist as words in English prior to the Bible being translated. Words like freedom,
Wow.
justice, even these words we just assume always existed didn't. We those came into our language through the Bible, and because of that, they discipled nations. They really did transform nations. And they also, I think of a time that I spent in Kenya. They changed the meaning of words as well. So in Kenya, there was a tribe that historically had a word for woman that was the equivalent of their word for tool. That was what a woman was. That was the idea that people had in their minds when they thought of women. They were just objects to be used. And then
Right.
when the Bible was translated into their language, all of a sudden that definition changed. And now women were image bearers of God
Wow.
with
Yes.
dignity and worth. And you can imagine how that just starts to change a culture.
Yeah.
So I could go on, but that's a little bit on just the power of words in a positive way. Now, what we're seeing today, as you said, is much more negative. We're seeing words being redefined, biblical words. You mentioned justice, truth, marriage is another big one that caught my attention many years ago. They're being redefined in the culture, and I think I've become alarmed because I think a lot of Christians aren't aware that it's happening, and so they're absorbing these, what I call counterfeit definitions or false definitions.
I want to take a moment and tell you about SPERO Natural Goods, helping you find where beauty and function meet through thoughtfully crafted restorative recipes. They have things like handcrafted candles. They're these beautiful beeswax tapers. They have cold processed soap and natural skincare. In fact, everything that they make is 100% natural. They never use artificial chemicals, scents, or colorants. All of the scents are from essential oils, and the colors come from herbs and clays. All the body products are anhydrous, which means they don't have any water in them. So the lotions come in a stick form, which is really convenient because it's super concentrated and rich, but it also doesn't get sticky and messy and spill in your purse. All the soaps are saponified, which means they take amazing ingredients like goat milk, rock kefir, herbal teas, and they turn them into soap. And let me tell you what, you can tell the difference. Their soaps are my favorite products from SPERO. They're very creamy, they're beautiful to look at, they work great, but they also last a really, really long time. You can really tell the difference in the quality. In fact, all their soaps have generous amounts of natural butters and super oils. And so your skin is their commitment. Go to SPERONaturalGoods.com. That's spelled SPERO, where you can use my code Alisa for 10% off of any order. Again, SPERONaturalGoods.com. Use my code Alisa. And you think about how important language and words is, because just a few things you mentioned in the
Mm,
beginning was the word, the
mm,
logos. We're talking about, the explanation of all reality. Jesus is the word, the living
yes.
word. And then you have the written word, which is God's self-revelation. It's literally how we get to know what God
Yes.
is like, who he is, what we are, what's
Yeah.
expected of us. And then you think about even the gospel. The gospel
Yeah.
is a message that's delivered verbally. There's this
Yeah.
famous quote that goes back to St. Francis, although I did some research on it, and turns out he never did say this. But
Mm.
the famous quote is, "Preach the gospel at all times, if necessary, use words,"
Yeah.
which
Very famous.
yeah, it's very famous, but it's like, okay,
Mm.
but first of all, whoever said that used words, that goes without saying. But also, that doesn't exactly work because the gospel is a verbal message that requires words.
That's right.
Certainly we can, with our actions, make the gospel more appealing to people or demonstrate the fruit of the gospel with our actions. But it's actually words are required to
Yep.
share the gospel with people. So if you're the enemy of our souls, if I'm the
Mm,
devil, I'm going to go
mm,
after words, right? And so I
yeah.
think that's what we
Mm.
see with postmodernism. We see just this constant redefinition, moving the goalposts, weaponizing language, and I think that's the thing you've really put your finger on. So what are some of the oh gosh, just, consequences of redefining words in our culture? Because obviously we end up with
Mhm.
ideological roadkill, people buying into ideas that are false because they think they're good things. But what would
Right.
you add to that? What are some consequences of these redefinitions?
I mean, they're just massive. It's just, it's, I think with your ministry, Alisa, you've done a lot on, your most recent book on deconstruction, and so much of it is around postmodernism, and just the word itself is truth, and in the book, I take that word on, and I look at the historic biblical understanding of truth as just that which corresponds with reality, with objective reality. There is a real world that we all live in, whether we believe it or not. It functions, and there's a creator behind that world. Again, whether we believe it or not. But in postmodernism, truth has been redefined to something that is entirely personal and subjective. It's an internal, personal, subjective sense of reality that exists only in the mind. Um, and so that is truth today as it's taught in our schools and understood in our culture. Well, when truth, that word truth, is redefined in that way, then you know, take any of these 10 words or any word, it can't have a true objective meaning, and so we begin by that's one of the consequences. We just see this massive redefinition of words. People feel like they can redefine words at will. Of course, I don't redefine, I don't, call up the dictionary, Webster's, and say, hey, I want to redefine truth or justice or whatever. So who does? Well, it's whoever can amass the power, right, to do it,
Mhm.
the cultural power. They're the ones that get to rewrite the dictionaries. So,
Yeah, and it seems like that I'm glad you started with that word because all of these other words we're going to talk through, things like beauty, faith, human,
yeah.
justice, freedom, authority, all of these words, like you said, if you don't
Mm,
have an objective view of truth, if you don't think that truth is something outside of you that you
yes.
discover, it's not something you make up, it's something
Right.
you figure out by looking out into the world, not into your own heart. But as our culture has
Right.
changed that truth maker from an external standard of authority to an internal one, well, it wouldn't
Yes.
even matter. Why even bother talking about the other words if truth really is like that? And
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
and most people don't actually live that way though. That's the thing that
No.
boggles my mind is most people go to the bank, they want, they expect their money to be there, they'll appeal to the law, they have signs on their
Right.
lawn that appeal to science and
Right.
certain facts of logic. But what do you think is the main reason that we as a culture have sort of taken certain types of things and moved them into the opinion category when really they're in the objective truth outside of you kind of category?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the postmodern, time that we're in, I mean, it has a history that goes back to the mid 1800s, and it's been a step by step process, of us getting to this kind of quote unquote post truth moment that we're in right now. But you're exactly right. I mean, people are very schizophrenic. Um, if my boss all of a sudden, wants to change the amount that I get paid every month, and he says, "Well, hey, it's my truth,"
Right.
I'm not going to feel very good about his truth, right? I'm going to say, "No, there's an objective truth that we agreed to, or whatever it is." So we're very schizophrenic. Um, yeah, I think it has to do with issues that we want. Essentially, I think what's at the root of it is a sense of autonomy. We don't want anyone telling us what to do. We want to kind of be the makers of our own lives and our own, you know, uh, destinies, so to speak. And especially when it comes to issues of sexuality or whatever, they're just uncomfortable, right? We don't want there to be a God that's kind of defining things for us and holding us accountable. So I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
part of it. At the same time, none of us can live this way. We all, you can't. I remember there was that terrific little video that came out. It was a little YouTube video that came out from the University of Washington Family Research Group or something. And this guy goes on and does interviews at the University of Washington and starts pressing the students on it, and he says, if I told you I was a woman, I mean, he was a 30-year-old white male,
Mhm.
what would you say? And they said, oh, well, fine, that's good. You could be a woman. What if I told you I was a Chinese woman, right? And that got a little bit
Yeah.
harder, well, I don't know about that, but I guess as long as you're not hurting anyone. And then you went even further. What if I told you I was a 7'3" Chinese woman? He
Yeah,
was like
just
probably five,
seeing
yeah,
how
5 foot
ridiculous
tall,
we
and
can
they
get
were
it,
like,
yeah.
"You," it was like, "That was too hard. You can't say that. You're clearly not 7."
Yeah, right. There's the line.
Yeah,
That's
that's the line. But
interesting,
he
yeah.
did a good job of just pushing people, to kind of wrestle with their own sense of, well, where do you draw lines then?
Yeah,
So
and that can be a good tactic to even help people understand the contradiction, because a lot of
right,
relativism is a walking contradiction. It's
it is.
self-defeating in that sense. So, yeah, I
Yeah.
remember that video when it came out. That was really fascinating, just seeing how far
Mm,
he could push it, where
yeah.
people would keep going with him. But you mentioned a second ago that one of the reasons you think people don't want to view certain subjects in the realm of objective truth is because they would have to actually submit their own will to something greater or higher than
Right.
themselves. And one of the words that you talk about is the word authority. Talk about
Yes.
that word as it, what is the true meaning of that word versus how that's been redefined in our culture? Because that's kind of a word that you almost have this sense with the social justice ideologies that have come in that any type of hierarchy or authority is inherently evil or wrong. And
Right.
the idea, at least within Marxism, as it flowers out into other things outside of economics, but sort of that it's like everybody having the same
Yep.
outcome, the same
Yep.
sort of level of authority, and so anything that's imbalanced would be an injustice. And so that really
Yeah.
comes down to that word authority almost being demonized or in a way. So talk about that
Absolutely.
word.
Yeah. Well, it's probably one of the words of the 10 that I chose that we immediately have the most kind of negative reaction to. We just see it, we immediately think, oh, in a negative way when we hear that word. And I think there's good reason for that, frankly. We live in a fallen world where authorities have abused their authority and often have hurt people, us and others, and sometimes really horrifically. So there's a reason for that. So I'm not discounting that. I begin each of the chapters by really concisely defining, trying to say, what is the concise true definition, and then how has it been redefined or is it understood in the culture? So I'll just read that for authority. I say for authority, authority is the power or the right to issue commands, rules, or laws, and to ensure that they're carried out. Human authority is delegated from God, the supreme authority, and is accountable to Him. When properly exercised, authority creates conditions in which people thrive by providing wise leadership in a context of ordered liberty. Jesus, as our model for authority and practice, sacrificially served those under his authority for their good. So it's very rich, this concept of authority in the Bible. But then it's been redefined today as an arbitrary, self serving, and often harsh and oppressive use of power and control, a concentration of power in human government or rule that is unaccountable to God, to a constitutional limit, or to the people under their authority. So you can see that's entirely negative. Now, the biblical view of authority is actually really powerful. When Jesus, I always think of this powerful episode when Jesus walked with his disciples and they were going to Jerusalem for the last time. He was going to be crucified. And he told them explicitly that he was, I'm going to be spit on, mocked, beat, and killed. He wanted them to be aware, but in their minds, they were really locked into this paradigm that he was going to become the king and kick out the Romans, and they just didn't hear him. It was one of those
Yeah.
kind of things where they just didn't have the ears to hear what he was saying. So they started arguing about power. It's like when you come into your power, I want to be in power with you. I want to have authority. I want to be the vice president, secretary of state, or whatever. They wanted positions of authority. And then they started arguing with each other about it. And then Jesus, calls a timeout and he delivers this powerful message on authority essentially to them. And he says, you know how authority is exercised amongst the rulers of the world and how they lord it over. Their great men lord it over them. He says, not so with you. I mean, it's one of those things where like, I'm going to just change your paradigm about authority. Not so with you. If you want authority, essentially, he says, if you want to be great, then you have to be the servant of all. For even I, right, the supreme authority, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, Jesus said. I, the supreme authority, didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give my life. And that's true biblical authority. Those in authority, they still have that right, that position of power, if you will, to issue commands, but it's entirely for the good of those under their authority, and it's for their flourishing. When that idea begins to shape any culture, you could think of it as small as a marriage or a family or an entire nation, it is absolutely revolutionary. And we've seen it when the Bible was translated and this understanding of authority shaped cultures. This is where you got the concept of civil servants, for example, that people that work in the government don't just boss people around, they're actually servants to serve them. Now, we're a long ways away from that, sadly, as we've lost our Christian moorings, but those ideas for many, many decades and generations shaped cultures.
There's something truly special about gathering around the table, slowing down, quieting down with friends and family, and just spending time together. And at the heart of every holiday meal is the food we share. And Good Ranchers is here to make sure your Thanksgiving is extra special and stress free. Now, I don't know if you've tried to go to the grocery store right now, it's crazy out there. Not only are they busy, but the quality of meat that you're going to get in the grocery store isn't even as close to the quality you're going to get with Good Ranchers. In fact, the vast majority of the meat we buy in the grocery stores are coming from overseas, where there's not a lot of transparency and not the highest quality standards. And this is where Good Ranchers comes in with 100% American, born, raised, and harvested meat, which means no antibiotics, no hormones, no seed oils, steakhouse quality, absolutely the best meat that you can buy. So go to goodranchers.com right now, and they are going to help you out this Thanksgiving with a free 10-pound Thanksgiving ham. This is a $110 value. Again, go to goodranchers.com, use my code Alisa, subscribe to one of their boxes of grass-fed beef, better than organic chicken, wild-caught seafood, or heritage breed pork, and they're going to throw in this free 10-pound holiday ham for free. Plus, you'll get free express shipping. Again, that's goodranchers.com. Use my code Alisa. Something that occurred to me, and one of the challenges I think skeptics bring about, and this is something I have to think about a lot too, because even when we wrote our book, The Deconstruction of Christianity, the biggest battle of the whole book writing process was just defining the word deconstruction, because
Mm,
people were defining it and still are in so many different kinds of ways. In fact, that's one of the reasons we wanted to write it when we did, was to say, okay, there's a battle over the definition of this word, and we want to throw our hat in the
mm.
ring with what we
Yes.
see happening and analyze what we see happening in culture. And what the challenge we would get, and I want to throw this to you as well after I
Mm,
frame it up, but it's like people will say, well, language does change. And there's a sense in which they're right. In fact,
right.
I was just
Right.
reading Lord of the Rings last night as I was going to bed, and there was this whole paragraph talking about how queer the woods were and the queerness
Mm,
of the woods. Well, if a
mm,
Gen Z kid is reading that for the first time, they're going to hear and understand that word to mean
mm,
something completely different than Tolkien meant when he wrote the word. And of course, the way I would approach that is it's the intent of the author that determines the meaning. Tolkien didn't have that type of queerness in view when he wrote what he wrote, so that word had this sort of connotation then. But at what point do we just yield it and say, okay, the word is gone, we got to come up with a new
mm,
word, or
mm.
or when do we continue to fight for the words?
That's a really good question, Elisa. I think I was focusing on words that are deeply biblical. These, in other words,
Yes,
these are so core
that's
to
good.
the biblical message, and just the narrative of the scriptures that you can't understand the Bible apart from these really foundational words like truth or sex or marriage or human. Um, so those are words I think we really, yeah, language does, of course, shift, in a fallen world, people are actively trying to change the meaning of words. And of course, behind that all is, the father of lies himself, right? So God speaks true words, and then he is always at work trying to redefine them. Um, but yeah, so I think it's really important for Christians to have a pretty deep sense of the actual meaning. And there is an actual meaning because God spoke it, right? And he revealed it
Yep.
through his scriptures. So have a pretty good sense. The word, I'm sorry, I don't want to go on a bit of a rabbit trail here, but, my last book was on social justice. And I wrote it in 2020, right after all the George Floyd riots. It released, and it was actually part of this book. This is a longer project, but I was working through the 10 words, and at that time in 2020, I had gotten to the word justice, and everywhere, I was having talks with evangelical Christians, even some of my board members in my small organization, who were challenging me to get on board with this social justice bandwagon, and I
Yep.
thought. Um, kind of what do you mean by justice? And I
Yeah.
was just trying to probe them on their definitions, and what I found was that this kind of false or this counterfeit cultural definition had come right into the churches. And I thought, well, this is really a disaster because that word justice is so important. I mean, it's God's very character. And so it has to be, we have to fight for that one. We can't just allow this one to be
Yeah.
redefined in the culture and then in the church, right? See, this is where the church becomes kind of I think we have a really important role as salt and light in our culture to kind of contend for the true definitions of these words, right?
Yeah,
So
that's really
certainly
good.
we have.
And
Go
I
ahead.
commend you for that too, because so often people who have more of a leaning toward working with homeless and poverty and hungry can be very vulnerable to some of those critical social justice
Mm,
ideologies because they sound so good. And if the words are redefined and you don't even realize it, you can think you're doing something good. And so I really commend you for doing that, for being vigilant to think through these words. And I really appreciate your answer just now because that even helps my thinking
mm,
that, there are sort of words that are in culture, words like tolerance, queerness, or like we mentioned
right.
before,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
deconstruction, that aren't necessarily rooted in a biblical doctrine. And the
Right.
words you're talking about, these are words that God spoke and God gave meaning to through his written word. And so those
Right.
are perhaps the words that we need to fight even harder for because we can't let them be redefined because we're not the people that came up with the definitions in the first place. It's not like the word deconstruction where there's this kind of battle over what does this even mean. God already spoke what they meant, and we need to
Right.
defend that. That's a really good point there. So let's
Mm,
talk about the word faith because,
mm,
I certainly think, and I've talked about this in my books and on the podcast before, I think I
mm.
grew up with maybe a bit of and I don't, it's not like somebody taught me the wrong definition, but I sort
Yep.
of caught it in my
Mm.
evangelical culture. But talk
Yes.
about the word faith. What does the Bible mean when it says faith? And then how has that been redefined and co opted?
Yeah. This is one of those words, faith, that has been redefined over the last 150 years in the Western culture. And it's almost entirely come into the church now, so that the
Mm,
church's understanding of faith is kind of really out of whack. The biblical understanding of faith, the Hebrew word for faith, emet, and I'm mispronouncing that for you Hebrew scholars, I apologize, but it's the actual same word for truth in the Hebrew. It's the same Hebrew word for truth, and it connotes something that's firm, that's reliable. Here's the key word: that's trustworthy. So something that's, you put your faith in something that you can trust, that's trustworthy, because you can count on it. And so this word is often applied to God Himself. He is true. His word is true. So we can put our faith in it. The New Testament, the Greek word for faith is pistis, and that means evidence, which is really fascinating. It means kind of going out and searching. Is there evidence? Is there evidence that I can trust it? So, in a very simple, you could use a very simple kind of way of thinking about this. We all, I'm in a new town here and I'm looking for a mechanic for my car. I don't know any mechanics in this town. And so I have to kind of go out and start digging around and searching for evidence about whether I can trust this person or they're going to rip me off. That exercise of faith is starts with asking questions. Can I trust? And then it searches for evidence, pro or yes or no. And then if there's evidence and it's leaning in that direction, yeah, it seems like I can trust. The final step of faith is, the English word is assent. You actually take your car to the shop, or you get on the airplane, or you bend your knee if the question is Jesus who He said He was in the Bible, and can I trust Him? Is He the true Lord of the universe? Well, the step of assent there is you bend your knee and you give your
yeah.
life to Him. So it's that step of ascent. And then, you learn, right? Once you fly on the airplane or whatever it is, yeah, I can trust that. And then you have that personal experience that you add into faith. So that's the concept of faith. But in the West, over really since the Enlightenment, during the Enlightenment, this is back in the late 1700s. This is a time when science was just revolutionizing culture, because kind of great mysteries of the physical world were being kind of solved one by one. And then there was this pride that crept into the human heart in Europe and in France, England, and these places. And the idea went something like this: I don't need to appeal to God or the Bible any longer. I can know everything through science and human reason. And so that's kind of in a nutshell what the Enlightenment was about. And it led to the secularism that we see today. So then the Bible, Christian faith, any religion really was associated with mythology, with being a fairy tale. You could believe it if it was helpful to you, but don't bring it out into public life, because public life has to be dominated by science, facts. Nancy Pearcey calls this the fact. Well, she calls it
Fact value
the
split, right?
fact value divide. You could also think of it as the fact faith divide.
Mm,
And so faith is personal, it's private, it's not based in science. But you can believe it if you want, if it's helpful for you. Well, that idea of faith actually has completely come into the church, and so many Christians believe
yeah.
that now. That it's, there's a separation between faith and science, and I believe this because I, it's helpful for me, or whatever it is. It's very personal and subjective, but that does real violence to the idea of faith itself. Now, again, I don't want to say we come to faith in Jesus Christ through purely reason or evidence. I mean, we do need the help of the Holy Spirit. We're, as the book of Ephesians says, we're dead in our trespasses, and so we need God to enlighten us. But that doesn't excuse us from using, evidence and reason and logic and, basic apologetics in this process.
Do your kids know how to study the Bible for themselves? If you're anything like me, you want to teach your kids the Bible, and we do that. We do all the planning and all the instruction. We read the scripture, we tell them what it means. But sometimes we forget that this might leave them lacking the skills they need to study the Bible and enjoy studying the Bible on their own. Well, Foundation Worldview curriculum has a curriculum called Studying the Bible, which solves this problem. It trains kids in the basic skills they need to soundly read, interpret, and apply the scriptures. It's going to help them understand the narrative arc of the story of the Bible. It's going to help them with basic Bible study skills like reading the verses in context, knowing the difference between a descriptive passage and a prescriptive passage. It focuses on the truths revealed about God. And it also is going to teach your kids about biblical genres, to know what kind of a book they're reading when they open up a biblical book. So these materials set kids on the trajectory of seeking God through His Word for all their lives. And they consistently hear from parents that they learn as much as the kids when they go through these materials. So check it out for yourself. Go to foundationworldview.com. Use my code Alisa for 10% off of any family license. Again, that's foundationworldview.com. Use my code Alisa. Also, as you were talking, I'm thinking about even, as Nancy Pearcey's two-tiered view of truth, of course, building on Francis Schaeffer. For anyone who's unfamiliar, it's
Right.
almost like truth is like this two-story house where you have
Mm,
things like facts, logic, science, facts that
yes.
are public. They call them
Right.
public truths because they're accessible to everybody in the public sphere. But then on the
Right.
upper story, you have things like your opinions, your preferences, your style of clothing you like to wear, the flavor of ice cream you like. And those are sort of your private truths. You wouldn't tell
Right.
somebody else they like the wrong flavor of ice cream because that's an opinion.
Right.
And then what
Yeah.
modernism did is put things like religion and morality up in that upper tier when really it belongs on the bottom floor. Like religion and
Absolutely.
morality, these are objectively true outside of you. And yet our culture, even with that redefining of that word, like your faith is private, whereas in reality, it's not. It's the faith is
Mm.
something you can investigate in reality through
Yeah, I
evidence.
mean, either God exists or He doesn't. I mean, either
Right.
Jesus existed as a historical person, died on a cross, and was raised again, or He didn't. And the New Testament authors were very clear about this. They said, if this isn't a historical reality, if this didn't actually happen, your faith is worthless. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. Our faith is based on reality, every bit as much as any scientist would contend for that. This
Right.
actually had to happen. God actually has to exist. This, and you know, yeah. So in some Christian circles, people are taught to fear hard questions. Don't ask these hard questions. Just believe. And you hear that a lot, just believe. There's this kind of faith in faith now that's very popular. If you just believe, it's like the faith
Yeah.
itself is going to bring something about. It's never faith in faith in the Bible. It's faith in the object of the faith, which is often God Himself or His promises. Those are the things that can be trusted in or relied on. So,
And it seems also that the word faith can also in our culture be redefined to be this really sort of fuzzy, broad, mushy word that just has to do with any
Yes.
kind of, your personal, whatever your personal religious beliefs are, that's your faith. And that's so important. Everybody needs to have faith, but it's really vague and it doesn't mean
Oh, I
anything
know.
really in our
Yeah.
culture. And I think
Yeah.
too, just even sticking with that sort of two-tiered truth that
Mm.
Nancy Pearcey brought about, I see even right now Christians who are sort of walking up to that upper tier, that opinion category, ethics and even politics
Mhm.
and certain things, whereas if it's as if we can disconnect those things from our trust and
Yes.
our active trust in Jesus. And those are just private. Like I'm not going to tell somebody else what they should do sexually or ethically, because that's sort of my private thing. Even if they think that the Christian faith is true for everyone, there's this tendency, I think, for us to compartmentalize those things and make them almost like this personal, private thing that we really shouldn't talk about.
Absolutely. It's been that compartmentalizing of our Christian faith. We talk about it in the DNA, the ministry I'm a part of is the sacred secular divide. I mean, many people talk about that, but Christians divide reality into these two categories. And the sacred has to do with God and the Bible and things that happen in church and my personal faith and whatnot, these spiritual things. And the secular world is pretty much everything else, politics, entertainment, marriage, even, you name it. And all of those things, we kind of almost imagine that the Bible doesn't speak to, that, the Bible only speaks to kind of these spiritual things. And when you think that way, if that shapes your reality, then of course, in those areas that the Bible doesn't speak to, politics, whatever it is, then we go to other authorities, right? Like, we discount the Bible, and that's been a disaster for the church. It's in a sense, we ourselves, Christians ourselves, are responsible for so much of the breakdown in the culture today because we've had this kind of privatized, personalized understanding of our faith that's completely disconnected from the culture. And when we do that, somebody else is going to shape the culture. If you will,
Yeah,
somebody else will define these words, right?
right. And
Somebody's going
we
to define words and language that are going to shape the culture. And if it's not us with biblical definitions, it'll be someone else.
right.
And then, of
And
course, we get kind of discipled through the back door because we send our kids to these schools where they're learning the false definitions. And then lo and behold, they're being discipled by the culture, if you will, right? So,
yeah, so good. And we are called to be salt and light. We're literally we're called to
yes, that's why
influence
we're
our
here.
culture. That's why we're here. I mean, the
That's
creation
why we're
mandate,
here.
right? And people will say, "Well, you shouldn't talk about that because that's being a culture warrior or this or that." And it's like, "Well, I mean, I don't particularly feel like I'm a culture warrior, but I am called to be salt and light, which means influencing
That's
the culture,
exactly right.
creating
Yeah.
culture." So,
Yeah, this idea of culture warrior, I mean, there's this negative idea, and of course, we're always accused of that, but the biblical idea is we're here to bless. We're not
mhm,
here to make war on the nations, we're here to bless the nations, Genesis 12:1 and 2, God comes to Abraham and says, "I'll make you into a great nation, and you will be a blessing, and all peoples, that is, nations on earth, will be blessed through you." And that's our heritage, right? Abraham was the forefather of the Jewish nation through which Jesus came. And the New Testament makes it clear that we Gentiles have been grafted into that same family and those same promises to do what? To bless the nations, right? We're not, that. So we've got to be in the nations. Again, these words, these biblical words, think about the word human. The Bible says that humans have immeasurable worth,
yeah,
unbelievable dignity. All humans, doesn't matter rich, poor, male, female, uh, you know, the unborn, un, you know, un, incredible value. No other, no other belief system comes close to that concept. So we have to be out there defending that. That's what it means to be human. That's not just what I say as a Christian. That is reality. So
yeah,
get a little bit animated about this, but this we are all on mission. You see, when you signed up to be a follower of Jesus Christ, this isn't just something for you personally. You're now signed up to this great hit community throughout all of time to bless your nation
yeah.
with the truth. That's
So
what you're
good.
here for. So,
So good. Talk about the word beauty. So how does the Bible present the concept and the word beauty versus how it's been redefined in our culture?
Well, I think for most people, Christians included, and even me until a few years ago, frankly, when we think of the word beauty, we think of it entirely as an entirely subjective idea. Beauty is in the eye of the
Yeah.
beholder, right? We're all familiar with that idea that there, that uh, that it's entirely. There's no when you talk about objective beauty, people would struggle with that idea. Um, so when I started digging into this, it just opened up incredible insights for me that have really, frankly, strengthened my faith. This word, probably more than any of the 10, have strengthened my faith personally in the writing of this book because I saw in the Bible that God Himself is defined as the source of beauty, that He is beautiful. There's I, uh, the perfection of beauty is what he's called in one of the Psalms that I don't
Hmm.
have it in front of me right now. He's the perfection of beauty. And he's beautiful both inwardly. The Bible has a concept of beauty that's inward and external. We're familiar with that famous passage in Peter, don't let your beauty be external only, kind of the adornment of the hair and whatnot, but let it be the, these qualities, the internal qualities. That's true of God as well. So God is a God of compassion, of justice, of graciousness. These are all beautiful. When somebody does something that's very sacrificial, very kind, we recognize that as beauty, and we'll say that was a beautiful thing that they did. So there's that inward sense, but then there's of course the external. And God created a beautiful world, a universe that's in, it's a work of art, and there's nothing in terms of any art that we've ever created that approaches it, right? I mean, God's
Hmm.
beauty that He created in His world is just magnificent. So then He created us to be people that also created beauty. The old Christian fathers, they talked about the characteristics of God's kingdom using three words: truth, goodness, and beauty. And I think as Christians, we understand truth and we'll fight for truth, right? Satan's the father of lies. We need to speak truthfully. We need to be people of integrity. Truth is important. And certainly goodness, justice, holiness, that's really important. But when it comes to beauty, that somehow gets like left off the list. And right now I think in evangelical churches we have a very we tend to think of beauty as something that's kind of ornamental, it's nice, it's not necessary. We have a very pragmatic view.
Yeah.
You often see this when it comes to church buildings right now, for example, where it doesn't matter what that building looks like. It's kind of a warehouse. We'll get it done for as cheap as we can just to get as many people in as we can. And it's a very different idea than earlier generations of Christians had when they thought, we are here to create beauty, and beauty actually speaks to God. And this is very powerful in a postmodern world. Beauty speaks to God in a way that words can't. It has an incredible apologetic. So Bishop Barron, the famous Catholic kind of apologist today, if you ever listen to him, he's very good on this. He says, today in a postmodern world, if I want to see someone come to faith, I always start with beauty, and let them be drawn by what is beautiful, and that eventually will lead them to the truth.
I'm passionate about the pro-life cause, and I'm also passionate about coffee. And that's why I love 7 Weeks Coffee. Not only is it the best coffee that I've ever had, it's mold-free, pesticide-free, shade-grown, low-acid, organically farmed, coming from the top 1 to 2% of beans in the world. But 7 Weeks Coffee is also on a mission to fund the pro-life movement, 1 cup of coffee at a time. And they do just that by raising hundreds of thousands of dollars to date and giving that to pregnancy resource centers all across the country. In fact, they give 10% of every purchase to these pro-life resource pregnancy centers. They've saved 5,000 lives, and you can help them out by drinking the best coffee that you'll ever have and funding the pro-life movement. Go to 7weekscoffee.com because just in time for the holiday season, they're having their biggest promotion of the year. You get exclusive discounts, free gifts, limited edition coffees. Got to check these out for stocking stuffers and for gifts. Go to 7weekscoffee.com, use my code Alisa to get 10% off your purchase. And you can stack that if you subscribe to the Heartbeat Club, which you'll get 15% off just by subscribing. You can get that additional 10% off by using my code Alisa for a total of 25% off. Go to 7weeks Coffee today and use my code Alisa. So what would the actual definition, like biblical definition of beauty be? As you're talking, I'm thinking
Yeah,
something along the lines of acknowledging that which is good or appreciating what is,
yeah.
fulfilling its telos, its purpose. I don't know. Am I close? What would you
I'll give you
say it is?
my concise definition. Again,
Okay.
this is my attempt. I'm not saying this is but going back to the scriptures, this is what I kind of tried to put down as a helpful, concise definition. I said beauty is a combination of qualities present in a thing or a person, both externally and internally, that give joy and deep satisfaction. Beauty can move us deeply and fill us with awe and wonder. Because God is its ultimate source, beauty has an objective reality that transcends our personal tastes.
Wow.
This was the hardest one for me to come up with a concise
Yeah.
definition for. And I realized it's when I was getting into it, it's going back to those three words: truth, goodness, and beauty. God created us to understand all three of them, and there's words that correspond to those that relate to our understanding. So the word truth is connected to the Latin word logos, that has to do with reason, logic, words and language, right? Mathematics, so we understand things in that way. uh, uh, Goodness corresponds to the Latin word ethos, or ethics, where it's kind of like the conscience, this internal sense that we have of right and wrong, and we understand things in that way as well. Beauty relates to the Latin word pathos, and that has to do with feelings and emotions, and we understand things in that way as well. But it's hard. Here's the tricky thing: when you're writing about beauty, it's hard to use logos, words, to describe something that
Yeah.
we almost use a different language for, if that makes sense. You
Yeah.
understand beauty in a way that almost transcends words and language. You experience it in music or in a beautiful sunset, and it's hard almost to describe.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
It
yeah,
almost sounds like they're different. Truth, goodness, and beauty are expressions of how we go about talking about the objective standard for all of those things, which is God Himself.
that's right. That's
Perhaps
right.
different expressions of that. I want to be sure we get to this word freedom, because this was a
Mm,
huge point that we had to deal
mhm,
with in the deconstruction conversation, because a lot of
mm,
people will say, and we talk about this in the book too, where a lot of people will deconstruct and say, "I am so free now." And I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of the people we quoted even said, "My religion now is freedom. Freedom is my religion." And
yes.
there's a sense in which I can understand
Mm,
feeling
mm,
a sense of freedom, casting off moral restraint. You don't have to toe the line anymore. You don't have to have this objective standard outside of yourself of good that you have to be aspiring to, which can be hard and can be,
yes.
it can feel like you're being, chipped away at. And so I get, on one sense, what people are meaning by that. But I remember taking a soteriology class from DTS. I was just, listening to the lectures from it. And
Mm,
the teacher said something really that always stuck with me. And he was talking about this
mm,
concept of freedom. And he said, when the Bible talks about Christ setting you free, it doesn't mean you're just free to go do whatever you want. In fact,
right.
we know that as Christians, we are a bondservant to Christ. So you're not really free, because you have a new master, but what you are freed from is the bondage of sin and death, and that captor that held you before you were in Christ. And so,
That's right.
yes, you're being set free from that, but it's not like you're just free to make your own decisions and have just this autonomous, your own authority or something, to bring in one of our other words. So how did you go about thinking about this word
Mm,
freedom, as far as how the Bible defines it
mm.
versus how we've redefined it in our culture?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite words. It's so powerful. I think it's because I'm from the United States, and the United States was
Land
really
of the
built on
free.
this concept of freedom. I think it's deep in our bones and our marrow. It's in many ways it's our gift to the world. This concept of freedom. And of course, it doesn't start with us. There's a history of it that goes all the way back to the Bible. But this is a biblical word, by the way. This is a word that in our world, our fallen world, apart from Scripture, there isn't really a concept for freedom. It's might makes right. Whoever has the power, it's survival of the fittest. You don't have freedom in that kind of a world, if that defines reality. You have freedom in a world where human beings have intrinsic, unalienable rights to life and liberty that can't be taken away even by the most powerful. So this is a really biblical concept, and that's why I think it's really important for Christians to fight for it. Back to your question, at the root of freedom, the core of it is choice. It's the freedom to, it's agency, it's choice. You see it in the Garden of Eden, right? It's really fascinating. In the Garden of Eden, God, God who is free, by the way, God, nobody constrains him. He does as he wills, as it says in the scripture, right? The only
Yeah.
thing that constrains him actually is he does have one constraint, and that's his own character. It's impossible for God to lie. He will never
Right.
violate his own moral character. But beyond that, he's completely free. And he created us to be free, puts us in the Garden of Eden, and he makes this magnificent garden. And he says, one of the very first things he says to Adam and Eve is, "You are free. You are free."
Yeah.
Then he goes on and he says, "You're free to eat," right?
Yeah.
From any of these trees, right? But, right, there's one that you may not eat from it. That's the biblical understanding of freedom, is that we are not God. God created us. And so there are natural limits and boundaries to our freedom. This idea that that was Satan's lie in the garden, actually, was
Yeah.
you can be completely autonomous. You don't need God. And of course, that's a lie. And when we believe that lie of freedom being completely and utterly autonomous, even from God and even from his creation, the lie there, the result, the consequence is we become slaves, actually. We can't live as free people in that. And just very practically, you can see that um, if you want to live completely autonomously, you're going to find yourself, bankrupt and broken very quickly, addicted to drugs and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And you're not free at that point. So there's a level at which we have to respect this kind of understanding that God created a world, He exists in it, and our freedom has limits and boundaries, and we're most free within that. Another
Yeah.
simple analogy I give in the book is like a game of like basketball. You can't even have that game apart from limits, rules. Everyone has to agree to what those are at the beginning, and then you can play, and you can play with complete freedom too. I mean, watching it is a thing of beauty when people are really excellent. So, but it only works, within those limits and constraints. Same thing
Yeah.
with freedom.
Mm.
So when the Bible says, in the New Testament, it's for freedom that Christ set us free. What it means, I think, is God created us free in the garden. We believed Satan's lie and became slaves. Now, through Christ, we can be free again. That is, free to be as God originally created us to be, as free human beings, not autonomous, but we function under His rule and His authority, but as free people. He wants us to be free people because that's how He made us.
Yeah.
That's part of our image bearing, is this concept of freedom. He didn't make us robots
Yeah.
on
Very good.
purpose. Yeah. So
Yeah. And even thinking about, as you're talking, going back to the garden, it's very interesting that right after the serpent's question, did God really say,
yeah,
when Eve was repeating back the command, which she got from Adam, she wasn't there when God gave the
right.
original command, but she left that word out. If you
Mm,
notice, and I was listening to a Hebrew scholar on this, God had said, "Of all the trees you may freely eat," and
yes.
some translations say "surely," but there's this sense of like you're free to have all
Just
of this.
just go for it. Just
Yeah, go
yeah,
for it, and she
exercise
left
that
that
freedom of
word
yours. Yeah.
out. Yeah, she
Yeah.
left that word
That's so
out.
interesting.
Yeah,
Wow.
which even from the beginning, you have this sort of co-opting of that word freedom or a changing of
Mm,
it or something like that. But, to your analogy with the sports, it's think about music. You've got a time signature, you've
Yes,
got a key that you're playing in. And
exactly.
if you're going to have somebody do a guitar solo, they have to be within the constraints and the limits of the key, the time signature, or else it's not going to sound good. It's going to sound like clanging, it's cymbals. It's not going to sound very good. So those to really express true freedom, it is limited. It is within constraints for it all to be objectively beautiful. To go back to a previous
Our
idea.
founding fathers just on this, they really understood this, and they banked a lot on the fact that they wanted to create a system of government, a society in which the people self-governed and they ruled themselves. They didn't
Yeah,
want to vest the power in a king. They wanted it to be in the people with representatives, but the power rests with we the people. And they were very clear that that was only going to work if the people themselves could govern themselves and do what
yeah,
was right. Then they could be free. And in order to do what is right, they recognized that they needed to bow their knee to God. There needed to be a strong church, and this is what set the United States' trajectory different than the French one in their revolution, because theirs was really a revolution of complete autonomy from
yeah,
God, and it didn't work out. Whenever that happens, it leads to tyranny. In that case, Napoleon Bonaparte. But here you see we're getting away from that founding fathers idea that in order to be a free nation, we have to be self-governing and virtuous. And you're seeing it in places like San Francisco, where you see these clips of these people breaking in and just stealing stuff, and that society is going to fall apart. It's going to run into absolute chaos, and then you get tyranny. So, and that's the least free kind of system that you can have.
yeah,
So, the founding fathers were very clear about this. There had to be clear boundaries, but those boundaries had to be internal. People had to have this sense of self. The Bible is very clear on this concept of self-government.
yeah.
You've got to govern yourself, and then you can be truly free. So,
Yeah, I was listening to Bill Federer on Frank Turek's podcast, I think last week, and one of the points he made along those lines is a lot of Christians, as they kind of get, for some reason, sucked into this pietism that would view the government and politics as this completely other thing that we
yeah,
shouldn't, we're too spiritual for that. We shouldn't be involved in that. And his point was, and this I took away from it, was that, when you have a monarchy, you have a king. But the way
hmm
that we are set up is the people rule. The people are the king. So if you don't get
yes,
involved, you're going to end up with a bad king. So be a good king.
yes.
Exercise your rights to influence people to promote biblical values. And I think that is something that is so important right now. Well, we're about out of time. This has been utterly fascinating. Would you please just let everyone know where they can connect with you, where they can find your materials, and whatever you want to say as we close out?
Yeah, so, well, thanks again, Alisa. Yeah, the book that we're talking about, the title of it is 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World, Restoring the Meaning of Our Most Important Words. And people can find out about that book. It'll be released mid-November, but we have a website that they can go to. It's 10wordsbook.org, 10wordsbook.org, and that'll lead them to the book. We have a Bible study curriculum that's going to be coming out with this. And then you can, of course, from there go to the Disciple Nations Alliance and learn more about it, the ministry from there as well.
All right. Well, I want to thank my guest, Scott Allen. Fascinating discussion. Pick up the book, 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World. You can go to 10wordsbook.org for more. And if you are watching on YouTube, it helps us out so much if you subscribe and click the bell icon. And many thousands of you have left great reviews on the audio platforms. So thankful to you all for that. And if you haven't done that, would you please consider doing that if you find the content of this podcast helpful? And then, of course, sharing it out on social media, even leaving a comment or a like as you see it go by. All of that helps so much. And let's remember that as we pursue Christ, we want to keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin. We'll see you next time.